The Arlington Police Department's major case squad worked Terri's case for months, and her parents papered the area with flyers seeking information and maintained the reward fund. But the major case squad was inundated with several other murders soon after Terri's case was assigned to their unit. Although they worked every lead, the case remained frustratingly unsolved. Before too long, the anniversary of Terri's slaying rolled around on Valentine's Day, 1986. Ann McAdams said for a long time she had checked in with the Major Crimes Unit regularly, hoping for news. By now, she told the Fort Worth Star-Telegram, quote, "I quit calling them because it was too discouraging. I have an uncle who's an FBI man up in Michigan. He says, if you don't find out who did it in the first 90 days, your chances are slim. I'm not real optimistic. As time goes by, it gets even harder. It's the first time we've had to go through Thanksgiving, Christmas, and her birthday without her. The time hasn't helped at all. In fact, I think it's gotten worse. We cry a lot." By this time, the Star-Telegram reported investigators had pursued leads into 7 states and had processed in excess of 200 people, everyone from Terri's classmates at University of Texas Arlington to co-workers in the financial aid office to neighbors. It hadn't helped. They had no more prime suspects than they had back when the crime first occurred. On June 6, 1986, the Terri McAdams case was reassigned to Detective Ford because the major case unit was dissolved. A word about Detective Ford. This investigator, whose notes I found to be very meticulous and well organized, went on to become one of the most esteemed investigators in the state of Texas. He investigated the Amber Hagerman abduction in 1996 and eventually launched the cold case unit for the Arlington Police Department in the early 2000s. During the 1986 to 2001 timeframe, the list of people that Detective Ford looked at in this case was exhaustive. You've heard all the work that was done to identify Terri's killer. But with 1980s police techniques and technology, it was not to be. Over the ensuing years, Terri's case received mention in the papers every so often as one of the 25 or so unsolved murders in Arlington. Detective Mike Simons went on to become chief deputy of the Tarrant County Sheriff's Department. He said, quote, "Jim Ford was the epitome of what you would want as an investigator working on your case. He was going to give it everything he had. I truly believed he saw it as a calling." In 2001, there was a big push to solve the 36 unsolved cases in Arlington since 1974. Detective Ford had helped start the cold case squad, but it consisted of only 2 members, John Stanton and crime analyst A.M. Zado. The two slowly began to review the unsolved murders that plagued the agency. The trend of reinvestigating long unsolved murders was being seen in law enforcement agencies around the country as DNA testing became more and more standardized. Of course, the cold case squad tended to prioritize cases that had physical evidence ripe for updated testing. Part of the challenge was that in the 1980s, the Arlington Police Department had sent evidence out to multiple different labs for testing. So locating the old evidence and finding out what was actually viable was part of the challenge. When the cold case investigators went to the property room, they located several boxes of evidence labeled with Terri McAdams' case number. Inside, they found a number of items including the filtered cigarette butt, item number 2, and Terri's blood-soaked bra, item E. These 2 items were sent to the Tarrant County Medical Examiner's office on February 22, 2001, for DNA analysis. While those things were being tested, the cold case investigators examined the major case books and reviewed the latent fingerprint cards. They saw that the print from the sliding glass door had already been entered into APHIS, and the remaining prints were not of a sufficient quality to be entered into the system. On March 5, 2001, lab technician Carolyn Van Winkle reported that some of the cigarette butt tip had been used up in the ABO testing that was conducted in 1985, but that there was still ample biological evidence remaining for DNA extraction. On March 20th, it was go time. The Tarrant County Medical Examiner's DNA lab reported that Ms. Van Winkle had successfully extracted DNA from the filter tip of the cigarette. Some of the DNA on the cigarette filter was the DNA of Terri McAdams, but a second DNA profile was isolated that proved to be a male DNA profile. Fewer than 13 loci were able to be extracted, but nonetheless, the profile was entered into the CODIS database. No hits resulted, but everyone felt that this was a very positive step. Now, they could use the STR DNA profile to definitively rule suspects in or out. Now that they had DNA evidence, Detective Ford revisited one of his favorite suspects whom he'd never been able to eliminate. R.G. Flick was a white male who lived at the Walnut Ridge complex within sight of Terry's apartment. He had showed an unusual interest in the case and spent long periods of time in the apartment office talking to the complex manager about it. He also smoked Winston Light 100's cigarettes. Detectives conducted a phone interview with R. Flick on April 8, 1985. He said his blood type was B positive, just like the suspects. Flick admitted he knew who Terri was and saw her out on her patio with her boyfriend frequently. But Flick refused to take a polygraph test and refused to give blood or hair samples or fingerprints. He was a Vietnam vet, a grizzled ex-Marine who worked in construction and was generally opposed to cooperating with police. Back in 1985, R.G. Flick's name had been kept on the list. Now, in 2001, Detective Ford learned that Flick had died of a heart attack on February 7, 1995, in Marion County, Indiana. Detective Ford reached out to the Marion County Medical Examiner's office and learned that at Flick's autopsy, tissue samples were collected and preserved in paraffin blocks for long-term storage. In order to obtain DNA from one of these samples, Detective Ford had to obtain a grand jury subpoena and court order instructing the Marion County authorities to release the tissue samples to the Tarrant County Medical Examiner's office. The company that was storing the samples, University Clinical Pathology Associates, received instructions to release the samples in May 2001. The autopsy samples were sent to Texas, and the complex process of extracting them from the paraffin blocks was commenced. Finally, they received the results that indicated that the DNA from Mr. Flick was not a match to the suspect DNA evidence. He was eliminated as a suspect on October 3, 2001. All that work for nothing. In 2002, Detective Ford learned about the case of a serial killer who had murdered 4 young, petite, white women in the Wichita Falls area and 1 young woman in the Fort Worth area between December 22, 1984 and May 6 of 1986. Of course, this was the exact time frame in which Terri McAdams was murdered in Arlington. The victims in those cases were Terry Sims, age 21, Tony Gibbs, age 23, Ellen Blau, age 21, Deborah Taylor, age 25, and Tina Kimbrough, age 21. Farian Edward Waldrop killed Tina in May 1986 and then called police and confessed. He was sentenced to 35 years, but was paroled in 1997, at which time he moved to Olney, Texas, and seemed to be living within the law. But with the advent of the DNA era, Waldrop became the focus of investigators looking into 1980s-era unsolved murders, and a surreptitious DNA sample connected him to 2 of the other murders, and he confessed to the 2 others. Deborah Taylor was the one whose body was found in Fort Worth on March 29, 1985, just 6 weeks after Terry's slaying. Deborah had been strangled. Waldrop was arrested on February 13, 1999, for the murders of Tony, Terry, Deborah, and Ellen. On February 11, 2002, Detective Ford requested Carolyn Van Winkle at the Medical Examiner's Crime Lab to compare the DNA profile of Waldrop with the DNA profile on the cigarette butt. Surprisingly, on March 4, 2002, Ms. Van Winkle reported the DNA wasn't a match. Farian Waldrop was eliminated as a suspect. In 2005, detectives felt really hopeful that they had found their suspect. Remember that they had hairs found on Terry that were determined by the forensic lab to have originated from an African-American person. This hadn't stopped the investigators from looking at every potential suspect who came along, whatever race he was. But when a vicious, brutal rapist and murderer of women who happened to be black entered the picture, he certainly seemed to fit the bill. Curtis Don Brown had been arrested on February 24, 1986, 1 year after Terry's murder, for attempting to burglarize the apartment of a young white woman less than 1 mile away from where Terry lived. Fine, burglary doesn't equate to murder. But Brown soon escalated. On May 29, 1986, he was arrested for the horrific murder of Jewel Woods in the Woodhaven apartment complex. Brown entered Jewel's apartment when Jewel was home, and in terror she ran across the street into the woods. Brown grabbed 2 of Jewel's purses and then ran after her and killed her with a rock. He also pulled down her pants, although it's unclear whether any sexual assault occurred. Then he walked away. Unfortunately for him, some observant police officers saw him walking down the street with 2 women's purses and stopped him. Jewel's ID was found in one of the purses, and when police went to her apartment, it was evident that something had happened to her. Brown was arrested, and when Jewel's body was located the next day, he was slapped with a capital murder charge. Brown was convicted of Jewel's murder and sent to prison. In 2005, as part of a new law requiring convicted violent offenders to provide DNA samples for entry into CODIS, Brown was mandated to comply. And in a refreshing turn of events, the law was actually carried out, and the sample was collected from Brown and loaded into the database. That sample alerted Fort Worth investigators of a hit to 2 other victims of the 1980s-era Fort Worth murder series. One was Terri Gregory. Her body had been found floating in the Trinity River in Fort Worth on May 30th, 1985. Her car had been found abandoned in Fort Worth with 2 flat tires that had been sabotaged. Terri had been sexually assaulted and shot in the face. The second was Sharon Kills Back, who had been missing for a week. On March 23, 1985, she turned up in a storm drain in Arlington with a ligature still around her neck. The causes of death for the 2 women were different, but the same serial killer was responsible for their murders, Curtis Don Brown. Brown was very seriously considered a suspect in another 1980s case. On April 19, 1986, Teresa Branch was kidnapped, sexually assaulted, and shot in the stomach, and left dead and on display in the parking lot of the Harmony Baptist Church. DNA was obtained from semen from Teresa's rape kit and entered into CODIS. It did not hit to Curtis Brown. Now, Terry's killer's DNA was in CODIS, but it wasn't a complete profile, and Detective Ford wanted to be thorough. So on March 23, 2005, he arranged for the male DNA profile in evidence in Terry's case to be submitted for direct comparison to the DNA of Curtis Don Brown, newly revealed to be a serial killer operating in Arlington and Fort Worth exactly in the time frame in which Terry was slain. Carolyn Van Winkle of the Tarrant County Medical Examiner's Office DNA lab did the comparison. Her testing showed that Brown's DNA did not match that of the man who had smoked a cigarette over Terry's dead body. Brown, who looked like a very good suspect, is suspected of killing other women, perhaps as many as 18, but he didn't kill Terri McAdams. Another man who was briefly looked at was Gerald Douglas, a black male who had been sent to prison in 1970 at age 17 for his role in the beating death of a Floyd Phillips. Douglas was released in 1984, returned to the Fort Worth area, and promptly racked up charges for assault, robbery, unlawful weapon possession, and possession of controlled substances. In May 1986, according to the Star-Telegram, police were hunting for him as a suspect in multiple beating murders, aggravated assaults, attempted murders, and aggravated sexual assaults. One of the attempted murders was the beating of Douglas's girlfriend, who was hospitalized after he hit her repeatedly on the head with a ball-peen hammer. According to the Star-Telegram, quote, police spokesman Doug Clark said informants have told police Douglas is responsible for severe beatings, several rapes, and other types of sexual assaults in the area. Police have contacted many of the victims, but all are afraid to testify against Douglas, end quote. Fort Worth police termed Douglas public enemy number 1 until they finally caught him on May 27, 1986. Intrigued by the hammer parallel to Terry's case, Detective Ford requested a confirmation from the Texas CODIS administrator Renee Hawkins that Douglas's DNA was in CODIS, and it was indeed in the database. Douglas was ruled out. In May 2005, Detective Ford considered whether the investigators could benefit from the new mitochondrial DNA technology that labs were featuring. He spoke with Orchid Cellmark Labs and learned that analyzing a single hair from mitochondrial DNA would cost $2,850. And furthermore, once obtained, that mitochondrial DNA profile could only be compared against a direct suspect sample, not an STR DNA profile, and this was an additional $1,400 cost. Due to cost restraints, it was decided not to pursue this avenue of investigation at this time. Detectives were 100% confident that they had the suspect's DNA on the cigarette butt, so having additional DNA from the hairs didn't seem as though it would add significantly more helpful data. I don't know what exactly was done with regard to the viable latent print found on the sliding glass door at this time. It appears it was resubmitted to APHIS in May of 2005, with no hits generated. This guy's prints were not in the fingerprint database containing millions of images of prints. The investigators tried to track down the original oral, vaginal, and rectal swabs from Terry's autopsy to re-examine them, given the sensitivity of updated technology. The swabs were believed to possibly be at the Southwestern Institute of Forensic Services, known as SWIFT's DNA labs. Unfortunately, a lab representative said the swabs could not be located, and they were likely destroyed after no sperm was detected on them. When Ann McAdams, who had remarried and was now Ann Hagler, called for an update, it wasn't very good news. In late 2005, Detective Ford assembled a list of 25 potential suspects from the original investigation to figure out who had been completely ruled out and who had not. We heard these names in Part 1, men like Little Joe Alexander and Waleed Hosseini. Other names were on the list as well, men who had been looked at over the years but never formally ruled out, like B.L. Hill, the maintenance man suspected of killing another woman with tools, Joseph C., the friend and co-worker of Terry's from University of Texas, Arlington, William Michael Tumlinson, a white male who had killed a 21-year-old woman named Gina in her Oak Lawn apartment in Dallas in 1982. Tumlinson jumped bond and absconded to Denver and was arrested and brought back to Texas. He confessed and was convicted, but the conviction was overturned and he was released. He had no connection to Arlington, but he had been investigated for murders of white women throughout the Metroplex, and his DNA was not in CODIS. Another was Tracy Lee Housel, a white male suspect in a hammer death and sexual assault of a male victim in Orange, Texas. Matthew Allen Phillips, a white male sex offender called the Northside Panty Burglar, whose DNA was in CODIS. Melvin Lee Cook, a white male multiple violent sex offender who was not in CODIS and was in Arlington in January 1985. Felix Flores Florio, a white male who was convicted of a similar assault in 1974, and Calvin Shaw, a black male and University of Arkansas football player, charged in a rape and attempted rape of two women whose buddy, named in the Arkansas police report, lived in Terry's building. In 2006, Detective Ford searched through the materials and evidence for the hair samples submitted by the original persons of interest in the case. He wanted to see if there was any root material that could be submitted for DNA. In the property room, he located boxes containing the following: Terry's fingernail clippings, the rape kit done on Terry, which had not, after all, been destroyed, the sliding door curtain with blood on it, 3 loose hairs from Terry's right arm, and left thigh, and 25 suspect or POI samples consisting of hair, blood, and saliva samples. On July 5, 2006, Detective Ford requested that the rape kit, curtain, and the fingernail clippings be sent to the medical examiner's office for DNA analysis. In the meantime, during the summer of 2006, Detective Ford did a lot of work on Melvin V., trying to rule him out once and for all. Remember that Melvin was the brother of the maintenance man Dave V., who had found Terry's body, and they both lived in the complex at the time of the murder. Melvin was arrested for peeping soon thereafter. His hair samples had been sent to the Swift's DNA lab in June 1985, but were sent back to APD property thereafter and were now missing. Detective Ford went to see Melvin and his wife in Russellville, Arkansas. Melvin told the detective that he'd never been inside Terry's apartment and certainly didn't kill her. He was very cooperative and gave DNA samples and fingerprints. Dave V., too, was interviewed in Arkansas. He wrote out a statement saying he'd never had sex with Terry and he didn't discard any cigarette butt when he found the body. He gave fingerprints and DNA as well. Detective Ford brought these evidentiary items back to Texas. The fingerprints were a bust. Neither brother was the source of the print on the sliding door. The buccal swabs were analyzed for DNA by the Tarrant County Medical Examiner's office. When the results came in, both brothers were eliminated by DNA. On October 16, 2006, Carolyn Van Winkle of the Crime Lab informed Detective Ford of various test results. She was unable to obtain a DNA profile from the blood stain on the curtain that had covered the sliding glass door. Just as the original lab had found, there was indeed no sperm or aphid phosphatase located on the oral, anal, or vaginal smears and swabs. And finally, DNA obtained from Terry's fingernail cuttings and clippings was her own. Next, Detective Ford turned to Gary Matthew Twine, a black male Fort Worth police officer who had been arrested on a rape and aggravated assault charge in 2001. The 27-year-old veteran, who was a corporal at the Fort Worth PD, was accused of sexually assaulting an acquaintance in his Arlington home. His arrest was big news given that he was a high-ranking police officer. After a mistrial, Twine had been retried in the rape case and acquitted, so his DNA was not in CODIS. But in 2006, Detective Ford was interested in Twine because he'd lived in the Walnut Ridge apartment complex at the time of Terry's murder, and he'd been talked to back then. But they had no DNA on file for him. Via a search warrant, buccal swabs were obtained from Twine by Detective Liz Hayes. Testing by Carolyn Van Winkle at the Tarrant County Medical Examiner's lab showed that the DNA did not match. However, Ms. Van Winkle detected similar DNA markers between Twine's STR profile and that of the suspect. She posited that the suspect could be, but did not have to be, a relative of Twine's. Quote, Carolyn also said that the DNA profile from the cigarette butt is most likely an African American, but does not have to be, end quote. After that, there was a lull in the case, but there was a significant development 3 years later in March 2009. Basically, a box of evidence was located at the Swift's DNA lab, and the APD was alerted that the box appeared to be from the Terri McAdams case. Inside the box, according to the inventory list on its lid, were 77 microscope slides including hairs and fibers from the crime scene, clothing from Terri, and hairs from Jeff B. and Michael G., which did not contain root material. Back then, autosomal DNA was not obtainable from rootless hairs. And then 2010 rolled around, and with it, Detective Ford's retirement from the APD. He became an investigator for the Tarrant County District Attorney's Office, but died in 2013 at age 58. Just to wrap up this era of the investigation, in 2010, another APD detective picked up where Detective Ford had left off. This detective noted that the Tarrant County Medical Examiner's DNA analyst Carolyn Van Winkle had advised that the suspect shared some genetic markers with Gary Twine. Gary had been eliminated by DNA, but he had a brother who also lived in the area. He was K.A. Twine. His DNA was not in CODIS and his prints were not on file. However, K.A. Twine had law enforcement contact in the past, and records reflected the officer's observations that he might suffer from diminished mental capacity. Detectives did a trash pull on this potential suspect, who lived at his childhood home in Dallas. They went through the trash can behind his house and pulled out some disposable razors and a bottle of mouthwash. These were sent to the Tarrant County Medical Examiner's Office to obtain a DNA profile for K.A. Twine, who lived alone, to compare to the DNA profile in evidence. It didn't match, and the investigation took a 9-year hiatus. On January 18, 2019, Arlington Police Detective Julia Hall was assigned the Terri McAdams cold case for review. She set about looking into everything that was in the case file and physical evidence remaining in the property room. It has to be said that I was told by the records department that at this point, the records were in a very disorganized state. They didn't appear to be in any kind of order and had not been digitized whatsoever. On a homicide investigation that had remained unsolved for nearly 40 years, that was a lot of paper and reports that were unfortunately in disarray. Luckily, though, the physical items of evidence were still intact. On March 24, 2021, Detective Hall sent several items to the Tarrant County Medical Examiner's Office for DNA testing. The items were as follows: Terri's bra, Terri's sexual assault kit, the drape from the sliding glass door with the bloodstain on it, Terri's left and right hand fingernail clippings, the paper match flicked by the suspect, the unknown substances from Terri's right elbow and Terri's left leg, and pubic hair combings from Terri. Detective Hall requested any DNA profile obtained from the testing to be compared against both Terri's profile and the unknown partial suspect profile originally obtained in 2001 from the cigarette butt. On September 17, 2021, the test results were in. Non-interpretable DNA was obtained from the curtain blood. The match found on the floor contained no useful DNA. But a YSTR profile was obtained from the vaginal swab from Terri's sexual assault kit. Did you get that? For the first time in the long history of this case, male DNA was found on one of the vaginal swabs collected at Terri's autopsy. Sperm had never been detected in the swabs, but that didn't mean that male DNA wasn't present, and it was. And this was a very big deal, because the cigarette butt had been tested repeatedly over the years and the sample was significantly depleted. But it had never been tested for a YSTR profile. So the decision was made to try to obtain a YSTR profile from the swabs of the butt, even though it would consume the remainder of the swabs in evidence. Well, this paid off. A partial STR profile was obtained from the cigarette butt at 10 loci, and the YSTR profile from the cigarette butt cuttings generated a partial YSTR profile at 24 loci. Comparison to the YSTR profile from the vaginal swabs proved that they were a match. Now they had proof that the man who had murdered Terri had raped her as she lay dying. And this was important because while the cigarette butt sample was depleted, they now had the vaginal swab sample to work with. The DNA profile was entered into CODIS and again nothing. Detective Hall presented a summary of the case to the Tarrant County Assistant DA Tiffany Burks, who approved familial testing on this case. I'm sure you recall that familial DNA searching involves a specialized search of the state DNA database for close relatives of an unknown suspect. I can only assume this led nowhere, as the Tarrant County Medical Examiner's Office sent a sample of the suspect's DNA to Parabon Nanolabs for forensic genealogy testing in February of 2022. A SNP profile was obtained, and Parabon's initial report, dated August 24, 2022, addressed the genetic admixture of the suspect. It confirmed that the suspect DNA profile originated from a black male. He had about 60% West African ancestry, 15% Southern African ancestry, and 24% Northern European ancestry. In October of 2022, Parabon commenced its genealogy analysis, uploading the suspect's SNP profile to both Family Tree DNA and GEDmatch. The top match located in Family Tree DNA shared 67 centimorgans of DNA with the suspect, not a lot. This match shared DNA with 2 other matches in the Family Tree DNA database, but those 2 matches shared fewer than 15 centimorgans of DNA with the suspect, not that helpful. The second closest match was a Caucasian of Northern European descent with roots in Wisconsin, Illinois, and Missouri, not that helpful. The third match had roots in Texas on both sides of the tree, but not any of the same areas as any of the other matches, and it had no evident connection to the other matches. Match number 4 also had roots in Texas in yet another area, but no evident connection to the other matches. One match shared just 35 centimorgans of DNA with the suspect, but 27 of those were on the X chromosome, meaning that she was related to him along his maternal line. But where that fit in was not evident from the low-level matches the genealogist could see. Match 5 shared 42 centimorgans of DNA, and match 7 shared 33. They were first cousins first removed to each other, and were the sole members of genetic network number 1, dating back to an ancestral couple from 1870s McLennan County, Texas, who had 10 children. And that was pretty much all they had to go on. Parabon's genealogist worked to build the tree for match number 1, the person who shared 67 centimorgans with the suspect. Although his profile was uploaded under a pseudonym, she was able to identify people she believed to be his parents and maternal grandparents. His paternal grandparents were likely named Smith, making identifying them nearly impossible. She also noted that his tree had roots in Texas and Louisiana. Parabon's December 2022 report stated, "It appears that the subject's parents are both from Texas and likely descend from ancestors who were enslaved prior to 1865. Due to multiple matches connecting to McLennan County, Texas, the subject may have a grandparent or a great-grandparent with ties to that county." End quote. So there was a lot of Texas, but that is a very big state. Without more information, the case was likely unsolvable. Parabon's genealogist made a recommendation about individuals who might be contacted for reference testing in order to provide more data. These were people from whom the Arlington PD might obtain DNA via buccal swabs, or who might consider uploading previously obtained profiles into GEDmatch. Detective Julia Hall mailed contact letters to several people with the last names Turner, Daniel, Walker, Hurley, Smith, and Hamilton. The only person who responded was a woman named Amy, who agreed to provide a reference DNA sample. She was requested to ask her mother and grandmother to participate as well, on the assumption that the older generations might help connect the suspect's ancestral lines, but they declined. Buccal swabs were obtained from Amy on February 8, 2023. On February 9, 2023, those buccal swabs were mailed to Parabon via FedEx overnight delivery. The kinship test results on May 19th indicated that Amy didn't share DNA with the suspect at all, despite the fact that they were documented third cousins once removed. And that was about where things stood when in August 2023, the Arlington PD handed the case over to the FBI. Their Dallas field office maintains a genealogy team, and they took over the investigation. They soon focused on a family of 4 sons, last named Sharp, all of whom lived in Texas and were old enough to have been the suspect who killed Terri McAdams in 1985. But only one of the brothers had a very relevant criminal history. Because he was deceased, there was no available DNA the FBI team could access for comparison. They were, however, able to identify and locate a close genetic relative of the suspect. APD Detective Devin Kofer and FBI Special Agent Seth Webb traveled to another state to meet with the relative, a female whom I'm not naming, who was the suspect's only documented child. The woman agreed to provide a DNA sample for comparison testing. The sample was sent to the Center for Human Identification at the University of North Texas Health Science Center, and a reverse paternity test confirmed that she shared DNA consistent with the parent-child relationship to the suspect DNA sample recovered from the crime scene. Her father's name was Bernard LaSalle Sharp. A press conference was held announcing that the Terri McAdams homicide investigation had come up with answers at long last. Arlington Police Chief Al Jones said his department had sought to provide answers on this case for 40 years. But sometimes, he pointed out, it takes months, years, and even decades to crack a case. He said, quote, "Today I'm proud to announce that our efforts paid off and we have identified the killer." He explained that Bernard Sharp was deceased, so no charges would be filed. But we hoped to provide the McAdams family with a sense of closure, he said. Chief Jones said they had established no connection between Sharp and Terri, and that it appeared the attack was random. "We don't have answers to every question, but it solved a big one for us," he concluded. Detective Devin Kofer, the detective who brought Terry's case over the goal line, spoke as well. He talked about the work done over the years and the decision to use forensic genealogy after the 2021 testing and familial DNA searching failed to solve the case. FBI Dallas Field Office Special Agent in Charge Chad Yarbrough praised the powers of forensic genealogy, which he said has transformed law enforcement's ability to solve crimes. Quote, "Investigative genetic genealogy is one of the most valuable tools that law enforcement has access to today," he said. I'm paraphrasing here, but he went on to say, at the end of the day, we do this for the victims. Yarbrough promised that the FBI would continue to devote resources to this crime-solving technique and continue to increase the number of personnel trained to use it. He made a plug for public participation, saying, "You can help solve violent crime by submitting commercially produced DNA samples to services that cooperate with law enforcement." Authorities at the press conference made it clear that kinship testing of a close relative of Bernard Sharp confirmed that he was Terry's killer. "We are confident that he committed the sexual assault and homicide," they said. Terry's sister Karen, sister Pamela, and stepmom Carol Ann McAdams attended the press conference. Ann, Terry's mom, had died years earlier. Karen spoke on behalf of the family. She said, quote, "Yesterday marked for us a day that we had all given up hope would ever come. I honestly cannot believe we are standing here today. After Terry's death, we processed through the normal stages of grief, ultimately arriving at the very uncomfortable stage of acceptance. After so many long years, we had come to accept that we would never know who murdered our sister. Our hope was renewed when 3 years ago, I reached out to Detective Julia Hull, and to my surprise and delight, I learned that they were working on Terry's case," end quote. Karen talked about her sister, quote, "Terry was an amazing girl, beautiful and full of life. She was the best big sister. She was a friend to everyone, loving and kind, one of the sweetest and happiest girls you could ever meet. Feisty and fun, she truly loved life. To know her was to love her. As I stand here today, I know that she and my mom and dad are smiling down on this miraculous moment. There really are not words sufficient enough to describe how this feels." Karen concluded by addressing all the members of law enforcement in the room, saying, "Our family will forever remain in your debt." Chief Jones wrapped things up, saying, "Over the years, it would be easy to lose faith and accept that this case might never be solved. But Terry's family never gave up hope, and our detectives never wavered and worked through all the roadblocks this case presented. Now we get to provide answers that this department has wanted to provide for nearly 4 decades. After the press conference, Karen told the Fort Worth Star-Telegram that while she didn't feel a sense of closure because the wound from her sister's murder would always be there, she did feel at peace with the knowledge at long last of who had killed Terry. Okay, so who was Bernard LaSalle Sharp? What do we know about this guy? Bernard LaSalle Sharp was born on July 5, 1955, to parents Cleon and Marjorie Sharp. He graduated from Dunbar High School in Fort Worth in 1973 and served in the Navy, stationed in Hawaii and Japan. According to the Fort Worth Star-Telegram, Sharp was a lifelong member of Baker Chapel AME Church in that city. He attended Sunday school there as a child and was in the senior choir. As an adult, he worked in janitorial services, starting his own company, White Swan Medical Janitorial Service, 2 years before his death at age 29. The Fort Worth Star-Telegram covered Bernard Sharp's death in detail. This next segment is adopted from their coverage. On Sunday, November 3rd, 1985, 9 months after Terri's murder, there was a devastating crime in Arlington. Denise Sharp and her best friend Debbie Delatorre were shot and killed by Denise's estranged husband, Bernard Sharp. On Sunday night, the two women, Denise's cousin Zenith Walker and another female friend, went to a fast food restaurant and returned to Denise's house around 10:15. They sat around talking, and the fourth woman left around 12:20 a.m., leaving Denise, Debbie, and Zenith chatting in the kitchen. Several minutes later, before 1 a.m. on Sunday morning, armed with a .357 Magnum handgun, Bernard Sharp broke into Denise's Ida Street home through a rear window. The women heard something, but before they could react, Sharp appeared in the living room of the home. He demanded to know what Denise had spoken to his mom about in a phone call earlier that evening. Then he spoke to Zenith, saying, "Zeni, give me a light." She said, "You know I don't smoke." He said, "Find me one," and she refused, and he just started firing. He shot up the living room and the kitchen, killing Debbie and Denise and wounding Zenith, and then he shot himself in the head. A police spokesman told the media he had to reload more than once. Definitely, there were many rounds shot. Indeed, Sharp shot Zenith 3 times, then shot Debbie 3 times, and then reloaded and fired at his wife 5 times. His next target was himself. Neighbor Benny Dollar heard the 2 series of shots, and in between a woman screaming something like, don't, not the baby." Zenith, wounded in the hand, arm, and chest by 3 bullets, managed to escape out the kitchen door and stagger across the street to a neighbor's and call police. When the first responders arrived, they found Debbie and Denise riddled with bullets on the floor, beyond help. But wait, it gets crazier. 2 children were in the house. 14-year-old Winice Thomas, Denise's daughter, was in a back bedroom the whole time. She was not a target Sharp was seeking. Neither was her 3-month-old half-sister, Sharp's own daughter, whom I'm not naming. I'll call her S. Sharp. And we know all this because unimaginably Sharp spoke to Winice. After he killed Debbie and Denise and Zenith was pretending to be dead, Sharp went into the bedroom where Winice was. According to what the 14-year-old told police, she was on the phone, mind you it was 1 a.m., when she heard an argument, gunshots, her mother screamed, "But Bernard, the baby," and then more shots. Suddenly, Sharp appeared in her doorway with a gun. He calmly asked her if she'd called anyone, and she said no. After reloading, Sharp walked back into the living room, knelt down beside his dead wife, and shot himself in the head. He was found lying curled up inches from her body. After the shooting stopped, Winice ran to a neighbor's, no doubt terrified and traumatized. Paramedics responding to the home located baby, S. Sharp, sound asleep in her crib and unharmed. Zenith ended up in the hospital for several days but recovered. She told the Fort Worth Star-Telegram, quote, "After he got through shooting, I thought, thank God I'm not dead." When she was recovered enough to grant police an interview, she told them that Sharp shot her first, and she slumped in her chair with gunshots to her chest and arms. She prayed not to let him come back to her. Denise and Debbie ran into the living room, but Sharp caught up with them. She heard Denise screaming, "No, Bernard, the baby." Denise pleaded with Sharp to calm down and told him she was willing to work on their marriage. But finally, Denise screamed to Sharp, "You're going to kill me, aren't you?" He said, "I have to. You hurt me, Niecy. You hurt me bad." Then Zenith heard 5 shots. The house was silent for nearly a full minute, and then one more shot rang out. Interviewing relatives and friends, police tried to get an understanding of what had driven Sharp over the edge, what had, as the survivor Zenith said, made him go berserk. It turned out that Sharp and Denise's 4-year-long marriage was in trouble. They had separated and reconciled a number of times prior to the shooting. The most recent split was just days prior to the murder-suicide. Denise had asked Sharp to leave the Ida Street house they shared, so on Tuesday he went to California for a few days. On Saturday, the day before the murder, he returned to Texas and tried to convince his wife to let him stay. That was a non-starter. They argued, and he left, only to return very late that night with a gun. Also recently, Sharp and his wife had argued over a shared credit card she had canceled. Bernard Sharp and Denise had met when both worked at Arlington Memorial Hospital, he in the maintenance department and she in the pharmacy. When Sharp killed Denise, she was working as a medical assistant in a doctor's office where her coworkers described her as wonderful, a good mother, a happy person. Sharp was less stable, unable to hold down a job and not seeming firmly rooted in any one place. The two had a history of domestic issues, with police being summoned to their apartment in Pantego several times before the couple relocated to Arlington. Each time, Sharp was accused of disorderly conduct, but he was never actually arrested. He paid a fine for a disorderly charge in December 1983. While living in Pentago, Sharp was convicted of several minor public disorder offenses, according to the Fort Worth Star-Telegram. Still, the entire horrific, tragic episode was a surprise to people who knew Sharp. Neighbors said he was a nice guy, a good neighbor. One neighbor said it was evident that Sharp was crazy about his little daughter. The neighbor who had taken Wenise in when the shooting happened, Mary Conley, told the Fort Worth Star-Telegram about Denise and Bernard, quote, "They were very nice people. This is a shock to everybody." Bernard's father, Cleon, told the Fort Worth Star-Telegram, "I really don't know much. He was upset, but he didn't seem that upset. He and his wife have been separated. He got despondent and seemed upset about it, but I never thought it would lead to anything like this." Bernard's mom, Marjorie, was also bewildered. Quote, "He seemed kind of upset because they were talking about divorce, but you know how young couples are. You have these ups and downs and you try to console them. Everybody has problems, and some problems are greater than others." However, there were other indicators that all was not as it seemed in the Sharp household. Several of Denise Sharp's friends said that she confided in them that her husband physically abused her and that she was planning to obtain a protective order and a divorce, and had no intention whatsoever of allowing him to move back into the house. Zenith, her cousin who survived the shooting, told the Fort Worth Star-Telegram that, quote, "He was just weird. He was a strange person. I know he beat her up and he was just crazy." The day before she was killed, Denise told her mother that she was unable to help Sharp anymore. She had tried, but she did not want to raise her two girls with him in the house. She didn't like him bullying her daughter, Wenise. She had consulted a lawyer just as her sister, Catherine, had been counseling her to do for a couple of years. Carrie Thomas, Denise's mom, told the paper, quote, "Whatever was going on in the last month was getting bad, and she told me she wasn't covering up for things he was doing anymore. She told me, 'Mom, I don't know why he doesn't act right,'" end quote. Learning that his wife was planning to divorce him seems to have been the last straw for Sharp. In his pocket, investigators found a pawnshop ticket. When they went to the pawnshop, they learned that he had purchased the .357 caliber Magnum revolver there just a few hours before the shooting. A police spokesman told the Fort Worth Star-Telegram, quote, "It looks like he came to town, bought the gun, and then hours later used it." The fact that the entire event was planned, at least the shooting of Denise was planned, was supported by the fact that Sharp's car was found parked on a nearby side street, and police believed he had deliberately parked away from the home so his wife would not see his vehicle. He had watched her and her friends come home and waited until he felt the time was right to strike. Sharp's shooting of his wife and the other women is an early example of something we've seen all too often lately: mass shootings carried out by a lone gunman. Many of these shooters leave manifestos, bear grudges, have agendas, and kill lists. With Sharp, it seems that his sole target was his wife and possibly her best friend Debbie, who was planning on moving into the house with Denise, and Sharp might have perceived Debbie as taking his place. Zenith, it seems, was just in the wrong place at the wrong time. Sharp made a very specific decision not to shoot Wenise, whom he actually spoke to while wielding the gun. He didn't shoot at her, and he didn't kill his 3-month-old baby girl S. Sharp either. Whether he went in there intending to also shoot himself is unknown. But I was very fascinated to read the comments of a detective on the case who spoke to the Fort Worth Star-Telegram. The detective was none other than Jim Ford, the same detective who worked Terri McAdams' case so thoroughly and conscientiously. At the time of the murder-suicide in November 1985, Ford was not on Terry's case. Remember, it had been reassigned to the major case unit, while Ford was in the crimes against persons unit, and in that capacity he worked the Sharp murder-suicide. Police interviewed workers at the pawnshop that was the origin of the receipt found in Sharp's pocket. That's where he bought the .357 caliber Magnum revolver for $304.81. Sharp had told the employees there that he was moving to Atlanta and needed a large gun to protect himself in that dangerous city. He made the purchase on Saturday, and reports from pawnshop employees were that he was calm, not agitated in any way, and seemed very relaxed and normal. Detective Ford told the Fort Worth Star-Tribune that this was unsurprising. In his experience, people who make the decision to take their own lives almost reach a state of calm acceptance. He believed Sharp was lying about the move to Georgia, and instead he always intended to end his life after shooting Denise. It's interesting to contemplate what made Bernard Sharp into a violent offender who killed multiple people. We have no information on his childhood. I do know that his parents were married for 72 years. Their golden anniversary party thrown by their other 3 sons was covered in the papers. Cleon and Marjorie are both deceased. Bernard was mentioned in their obituaries. So what else had Bernard Sharp done? We don't have a lot of details about his criminal history. I do have a short report on one incident. On December 1st, 1984, Arlington PD officer Glenn Cole was working radar on the 1200 block of Browning Drive when around 8:45 a.m., a late model Toyota pickup truck sped northbound on Browning. Using his radar gun, Officer Cole determined that the pickup truck was going 42 miles an hour in a 30 zone. He stopped the vehicle at Browning and Mitchell and approached the driver and asked to see his driver's license and proof of insurance. The driver, who identified himself as Bernard Sharp, had only an insurance card. He said his wife had his driver's license because she'd used it to cash a check, and she hadn't given it back to him yet. Officer Cole, being no dum-dum, ran a driver's license check and a warrant check. There were no warrants for Sharp's arrest, but his driver's license was under suspension. Sharp was placed under arrest for driving with a license suspension, and his vehicle was towed to the impound. He was booked into the jail at 5'10", 150 pounds, and it was noted that he was carrying a knife. His address of record was the 1825 Ida Street residence, where he would kill his wife and her friend 11 months later. After booking, Sharp was then released pending charges, and a citation for the speeding violation was issued. What I don't understand is why the police report I was given about this incident is titled Incident Type Burglary Residential. Sharp was pulled over for speeding, but when his car was impounded, inside was found a Panasonic handheld radio, a vacuum cleaner, a dustbuster, a tool belt of various tools, and a socket set with sockets. These are all things that could legitimately be in the possession of someone who worked as a janitor, and I never saw any additional reference to a burglary charge. Anyway, we know that Sharp broke into Jeff's apartment and killed Terri just a couple of months later on February 13th, 1985. Next, police showed up at Sharp's house on March 2nd, 1985, with a warrant for the driving with a suspended license charge. Can you imagine how nervous Sharp must have been when the cops showed up at his door just 2 weeks after Terri's murder? When they said they were there on the license violation, he must have breathed a massive sigh of relief. Especially because, as a registered sex offender, Sharp was likely very eager to avoid police attention. Yes, Sharp was a registered sex offender, and this was why he had been pulled into the Terri McAdams investigation. To my dismay, I have zero details of what Sharp did to get himself on the sex offender registry. Unfortunately, I could not get Detective Kofor to speak with me about this case, so I don't have many details about Sharp's criminal history, but he was on the sex offender list in Arlington when Terri McAdams was slain. And it turns out that Bernard Sharp's name was in the McAdams case file. Sharp was interviewed back in 1985 by Arlington detectives solely based on his race, which was black, proximity, and his record of 2 prior sexual assaults. He was one of dozens of sex offenders who were questioned on the case. Back in 1985, when Arlington detectives got Sharp's name after running the list of known sex offenders in the area, they decided to interview him. Shortly after Terri's murder, Detective Bloom spoke to Sharp by phone, but he declined to come in to give hair samples, stating, in effect, that he didn't want to be railroaded on a homicide case. Then on April 9th, 1985, Detective Zimmerman and Detective Bloom paid Sharp a visit at his Ida Street house. Notes from this interview reflect that Sharp claimed he owned tennis shoes but no jogging shoes. He smoked Merit 100 cigarettes, he said. He owned his own business called White Swan Medical Janitorial Service. He usually started work after 5:30 p.m. when the doctor's offices closed and worked until 2:30 or 3:30 in the morning. When asked about his history of sex offenses, he stated that about 10 years prior, he was arrested by Fort Worth PD. Detective Bloom's notes say, quote, "From his story, it appears that it was indecency with a child." He said that the last arrest was approximately 4 years ago by Pontego, where he evidently exposed himself to his female neighbor at his apartment building. I asked him if he could remember what he was doing at the time of the McAdams murder, but he could not remember, stating that he might have been working. I asked if he kept records for his business, and he said no, that he works on a contract basis by the month. Sharp stated that he does not do business in the north half of Arlington, and the furthest north he works is Randall Mill by Arlington Memorial Hospital. He does not know his blood type. Both Zimmerman and I feel that he has pervert tendencies, but based on the information we have, he probably did not commit the offense, end quote. Okay, fine. Sharp didn't set off any alarm bells in the detectives' minds, and they thought he was a low-priority suspect for the Terri McAdams murder. But they still kept him on the list of men to be checked. A report from Detective Zimmerman dated March 13, 1985, says, quote, I received the crime lab request on print comparisons on registered sex offenders Larry Pointer, Brad Pippins, Jerry Hill, and Bernard LaSalle Sharp. The crime lab advises that there is no comparison on the prints that were submitted to those prints found in the offense location. So Sharp's prints did not match the one found on the sliding glass door connecting Jeff's bedroom with the patio. In the detectives' files, I found an undated to-do list written by one of the detectives, which says, quote, re-interview Bernard LaSalle Sharp. Hair samples, ? Blood type, ? Smoker, ? What buildings does his janitorial service clean, ? Dillard's, Reno Cleaners, UT Arlington offices? Of course, these were all places connected to Terri. But detectives were never able to re-interview Sharp. When he died that November, the investigators on that double murder-suicide attempted murder mess, even Jim Ford, who worked both cases, had no reason to connect him to Terri. The murders he committed were completely different, targeting his wife and her friends. He used a gun, not a hammer. He hadn't made a dying declaration of guilt. There was no reason to say, maybe he killed Terri, other than perhaps it could have occurred to someone that he was deranged, violent, and tortured, and something put him over the edge in 1985. Okay, so how did Bernard Sharp end up killing Terri McAdams? There have been reports that Sharp lived near the Walnut Ridge apartment complex where Terri was killed. I can't verify that. The house he shared with Denise on Ida Street was about 4.5 miles away. We know that he was nocturnal, just as the FBI profile stated. He finished up his janitorial work very late in the evenings. But he also worked for himself, and there's no telling how much unfettered roaming around he did late at night, looking for targets of burglary or worse. You heard the Arlington chief of police say at the press conference that the investigators had uncovered no connection between Terri and Bernard Sharp. The crime was believed to be random. I find that a little hard to believe. There were only 3 apartments on the ground floor of the apartment complex where the sliding glass door lock plates were determined to have scratches on them. One was Jeff's and one was Terri's. I think it unlikely that Bernard Sharp just decided to enter any random apartment on that fateful February night in 1985. How would he know there wasn't a big, strong man inside or a locked and loaded homeowner? I think he knew that Terri was in the apartment alone. I think he must have been watching her. I don't know if he could see into the bedroom from the sidewalk outside or if he could see into the living room slider and see the TV was on and Terri was solo. What Sharp's intentions were, we can't know for certain, but Terri was hit with something hard that was not believed to have come from her and Jeff's apartment. I think Sharp broke in, armed with lock-picking tools and a hammer. In the bedroom, he found Terri's wallet and rifled it, tossing it on the floor. Terri heard him and went into the bedroom. He was waiting for her and ambushed her with a blow to the head. I was unable to learn whether he was indeed left-handed, but that was the theory based on the circumstances. Terri fell face first on the carpet, and he threw her on the bed and kept hitting her. He raped Terri on the bed, took her ring off and pocketed it, lit up a cigarette and calmly smoked it down to the butt and then flicked it and left out the slider. Terri slid to the floor and curled up against the wall where she bled to death. I want to know what happened to Terri's engagement ring. I wonder if Sharp could have given it to Denise. He broke into Terri's apartment on the night preceding Valentine's Day. I don't think it's out of the realm of possibility that he was looking for a piece of jewelry to bestow upon his pregnant wife. Or perhaps, after the murderous deed, he saw it and thought, maybe Denise will like me again if I give her a ring. Of course, if Denise died wearing the ring, its connection to an unsolved murder would not have been something police would have been likely to put together. Speaking of Denise, one of the last things she told her mother was that she was done covering up for Bernard. We don't know if she meant covering for him when he failed to show up for work, which one of the articles said she sometimes did, taking his janitorial shift so he wouldn't get fired, or whether she meant covering for him for more nefarious things. I doubt very much that she knew about Terri, although nothing would surprise me at this point. I think it's safe to say we don't know all of the crimes committed by Bernard Sharp. The looming question is whether he killed anyone besides Terri, Debbie, and Denise. Since he died in 1985, his DNA was not in CODIS. I can only assume that it is now, as the Arlington PD has stated they continue to investigate Sharp and his activities, to see if they can connect him to any more unsolved murders in the area. After 38 years, Terri McAdams' case is solved thanks to forensic genealogy. And if you were one of the bad guys, they're coming for you. This is the final regular DNA ID episode of the 2024 season. Next week will be the Year in Review episode in which we discuss all the victims and their killers that we covered this year. Then the show will be on winter break and premiere with all new episodes of Season 5 on January 20th, 2025. Have a safe, happy, and healthy holiday season. Recently, I let listeners know about a new benefit available to them called an AbJack Insider subscription that's available through Apple Podcasts. An AbJack Insider subscription will give listeners ad-free access to every bit of DNA ID content published, both past episodes and future episodes. It will also give you benefits like early access and bonus content. Head over to Apple Podcasts and click on the DNA ID show page or the AbJack Entertainment channel to start a free trial. Thanks for listening to this episode of DNA ID. If you'd like to listen to the show ad-free and help support the show in the process, please head over to patreon.com/DNAID. And if you're interested in some fun DNA ID merch, visit the store at customizedgirl.com/s/DNAID podcast. To contact the show, please email us at dnaidpodcast@gmail.com. Follow us on social media at DNAID Podcast on Instagram, at DNAID Podcast on Twitter, or on Facebook at facebook.com/DNAID Podcast. Finally, if you want to visit our website, go to DNAIDpodcast.com. You'll be able to get all the episodes of the show, leave comments on episodes that I can respond to, and you can even leave voicemails. You'll get all the latest news about the show and important updates. Find links to our social media, merch, and a lot more. It's really your one-stop shop for everything DNA ID. DNA ID is written, researched, and hosted by me, Jessica Betancourt. It's produced by me and Mike Morford of AbJack Entertainment. Music by Connor Betancourt. Check out our other collaborative podcasts, Scene of the Crime, Missing Persons, and Beyond Bizarre True Crime.